Hi. So this is sort of a part two or a follow-up, I guess, to my previous video on what I regard as eco-extremism. I defend the use of that term because I think if someone is being so zealous that they don't care about hurting the public, to me that is extreme. It's extremism. I wouldn't go so far as to call them terrorists. That's hyperbole, and it's not a term that should be going around gently, but I do think it's extremism. Um, because it's our way or it's that's it. Um, but I want to talk now about what I consider to be practical approaches to the problem, because I've always said it's easy to criticize, but you need to offer alternatives. So, as I've criticized Extinction Rebellion and Insulate UK and other groups, I have a responsibility to suggest what I think should be alternatives to their approaches. Well, here's a few, and I'm not saying this is exhaustive, these are just some ideas. Because I do believe, as a caveat or as an underlying point here, I do believe that climate change is a fundamental problem facing humanity, maybe the biggest problem. I mean, we can't ignore it. We can't ignore that this year in British Columbia, a temperature of 49 degrees Celsius was recorded in British Columbia, Canada. That's a temperature that even exceeds the Gulf states average. Um, So I don't think we can say, "Oh, this is just it's a non-issue." It's not necessarily that natural disasters are deadlier than before. I mean, you could look at the 1970s, where there was some very big natural disasters. An example of this, 1970, um, Bangladesh, what was then East Pakistan, one of the deadliest cyclones in history, Bola. It's known as the Bola cyclone. It killed up to 500,000 people. 1975, Typhoon Nina caused devastation in China. Again, hundreds of thousands lost their lives. So it's not necessarily that natural disasters are costing more lives, but I do think there is a strong indication that they're becoming more frequent. Storms are becoming more frequent, and certainly temperatures are rising. And I do think with an ever increasing human population, we're approaching 8 billion now, um, currently around 7.8 billion. With this problem increasing, we are going to see increasing issues with that. I don't think we can ignore it. So I don't agree with those more on the conservative side of things to say it's just one big hoax. No, I don't agree with that. I think it is a very pressing problem. And the argument, well, the Earth's always had cyclical change. That's true, but what's happening would appear to be that it's becoming more frequent, and it is cannot be divorced from human activity. So yes, there's always been climate change in the Earth cycle long before humanity, but I think, just looking at it from a point of common sense, when you have an ever increasing human population, how we use the Earth's resources, how we interact with the Earth, it's going to have an impact. I think it's foolish to say otherwise. But anyway, some things that can be done that are practical, supporting green business. This is something that taps into the wider approach of green economics. I think that's a very practical thing, because it's pro humanity, it's pro society. One of the big problems I think with a lot of the protest groups is they give the impression they want us all to live in mud huts and just get away from the modern world. I don't think it needs to be that way. I think green business and supporting green business, maybe tax cuts for green business, they are practical measures that can really, really promote something positive. So that's one answer. Promote green business. That is companies that use sustainable methods to get their products. And here's the thing, for all the dystopian image that we often hear from protest groups, a lot of big companies, to their credit, are changing the way they approach things. Now, there's more can be done. I think, for example, McDonald's needs to get rid of their ridiculous plastic toys. I recently had a McDonald's meal and they had one of those little gadget things. And that's just a waste of plastic. A child will look at that for 5 minutes and it gets thrown away. And where does it end up? You can't recycle all plastic. So more often than not, it ends up in the world's oceans, which then destroys marine life. That's a serious, I think plastic waste to me, particularly on an island like the UK, an island nation, um, it's one of the biggest issues. So reducing plastic waste, I think, is we've had some developments, we've had some improvements, but not significant enough. I think more can be done. When you get products that are covered in plastic cellophane, that's really not needed. So lobbying companies that do that, pressuring them to change their ways, is one practical approach. And how do we do that? Um, Petitions, lobbying parliamentarians to pressure them. There's lots of ways to do that. I think that we have to look at the world. Uh, this is not an equilibrium. Not every country produces the same amount of carbon emissions. One argument often is that developing countries are disproportionate in what they produce. Excuse me, developed countries. That's probably true, but the single biggest carbon emitters, unless I'm mistaken, is China, India, and the United States. Those three countries alone account for probably the vast majority of carbon emissions. So, when this issue is brought up, the Chinese say, well, why should we do anything when the Americans aren't doing it, and vice versa. But, this is something that affects the whole planet. So countries cannot be selfish and just look at what's good for them. An example of this is when the Brazilian wildfires were going on, and Bolsonaro's attitude was, oh, well, the Amazon is Brazilian sovereign territory, so other countries should mind their own business. Well, yes, the majority of the Amazon is within Brazilian territory. Some of it falls into Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, but it's the lungs of the world. So I believe that countries that have unique ecosystems, and two particular countries come to mind with this, Brazil and Indonesia, they do have a unique responsibility because they have such a profound ecosystem. I guess you could say Russia as well, because the Arctic tundra, in fact, there's more trees, believe it or not, in northern Russia, in Siberia, in the Arctic Circle than there are in the whole of the Amazon. So countries that have unique ecosystems, I would argue, do have unique responsibilities. It's not good enough to say this is our sovereign territory, so other countries should mind their own business because it all contributes. Um, but yeah, there has to be efforts by those countries. So in this is one area where other political differences can be put aside or should be. So China and the United States, China and the West has some very, very deep differences at the moment. That's not going to change. We have very profound differences on human rights, on a wide range of issues. But climate change is something that I think we should work with the Chinese on. It's one area I think we can work with them on because it affects everyone. And it could be a win-win situation if China is supported in this regard to promote, green cities and so on, then they can win from that in terms of mutual, let's say, green trade. I think that's an area that can be explored. To be fair to the Chinese government, and believe me, I'm no fan, but I think they have improved. For example, the air quality in Chinese cities has actually improved in the past 5 years. It's no longer quite at that level of constant smogs, which major cities like Beijing was witnessing 10 years ago. I think it has improved. So, I don't on say anything I've said about the Chinese government, but credit where credit's due. Indian cities have still some way to go. Delhi's pollution problem is horrendous. So I think encouraging governments, all governments, to improve is very, very important. This is something that's going to come up in the Glasgow COP26 summit. But there needs to be a political willpower, but it needs to show that it's not partisan. It's not like some sort of Western agenda or it's about Chinese growth or whatever. There needs to be an effort by world leaders to show that there's a mutual interest in this, that helps all countries. So yes, I would say developed countries have responsibility, but all countries have responsibility. Um, that's an area. Innovative ideas. There are a lot of great minds out there, and there's with that a lot of great ideas can come to help reduce carbon emissions. For example, I forget which city it is, but using the cooking oil from restaurants to power public transport, that sort of biofuel innovation, that reduces the reliance on fresh fossil fuels. That's a good thing. Um, it's just one idea. There's others. I mean, the possibilities are endless. We have 8 billion people almost in the world. There's going to be thousands of great minds out there, which means thousands of innovative ideas. Those are ideas that can be utilized and supported, and I think governments should collectively make a conscious effort to support innovative people who are coming up with these ideas. Give them funding, you know. That's an area that can be looked at. Individual responsibility. We all have responsibility. Reducing unnecessary energy, um, recycling. I'm not suggesting that recycling alone answers the problem, but it certainly doesn't hurt. Um, Reusing bags. I try to. I'm not going to lie. I don't, I will use plastic bags for waste, but I try to double them up and so on. I try to, it's not ideal, and I have responsibility. But for shopping purposes, I do try to use sustainable bags. I recycle. Well, I don't fly at the moment because of the pandemic. If I drove, well, I don't drive. I'd look at what's on the market. If an electric car is not overly expensive, I would certainly consider it. So the usage of electric vehicles. Um, I think also lobbying train companies to reduce their prices. In the UK, they are extortionate prices, right? And this is ridiculous because if the government wants people to go green, they need to do what they can to lobby and to pressure these big railway companies to lower the prices, which means more commuters using transport, public transport, which means less reliance on vehicles in big cities, which means lower carbon emissions. And it's a win-win because more potential customers is good for business, those railway companies. So to me, it's nonsensical that they're not using this. They're not trying to encourage more people to use the railways, and they could do that by reducing the prices. They say that it's necessary for an overhaul of the system, but what they're doing is that they're going to put people off. Of course, some people have no choice. If they're commuting, say they live in the home counties and they have to commute into London to work, they've got no choice but to use that transport. But A, it's not always reliable, and B, it's an extortionate price. So the big railway companies really need to start grasping public sentiment on this. That's also pro ecology because the more people that use it, the less reliance on cars, reduce carbon emissions. It's just common sense. So I think those are all things that can be done. I'm not saying it's just those things. I think there's many others as well. Individual responsibility, um, lobbying governments to reduce plastic waste, for example, supporting green business. These are all things that can be done. And promoting innovative ideas. But one thing I would insist on is that this dystopian worldview that green protesters often have, that the only way to solve the problem is if we get away from the modern world and we just basically reduce everything. I, Even if that was the solution, I do not agree morally with it. I don't agree that the way to solve a problem for the future is that we all just get away from the modern world. Because given some of the arguments I've heard protesters come out with, and there's a lot of hyperbole. Extinction Rebellion has scared children. They've told them that billions of people are going to die within the next 10 years. That is enormous hyperbole for a start. It's irresponsible, but it's some of their solutions is just dystopian nonsense. But anyway, those are some solutions, or at least some approaches that I think are practical. At the very least, they can't hurt, and they can be utilized. To me, reducing plastic waste is one major issue, particularly for island countries like the UK.